Today we're going to talk about the James Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies. Let's go. So, if you didn't know this about me already, I am a huge James Bond fan. Some of you know this, and those of you who don't, surprise. Welcome to this discussion. I have written papers on Bond. I've watched the films bajillion thousand times. I've written dissertations about Bond and his literary counterpart and his cultural impact and all these things. So needless to say, I love the character. I love the films. I'm a fan of the books, the video games, love the games, love it all. This film that we're going to talk about is probably my favorite film in the Bond series. It's not to say that it's the best. I don't think it's the best of the series. That is still reserved for, in my opinion, Casino Royale, the 2006 version. There are a few versions of Casino Royale out there floating around. A couple of the versions. There's the 1954 version starring Barry Nelson, who no one ever counts as probably actually the first on-screen Bond, and the 1967 version starring David Niven and as 007, and Ursula Andress, who, if you know the Bond films, you know she was the first official Bond girl with Sean Connery in Dr. No and all that. We're not talking about those two. I think the 2006 version of Casino Royale is probably the best film in the entire series, but that's another discussion. Today, talking about Tomorrow Never Dies. Now, first, before I get into it, talk about why is this my favorite. I don't know. I think a lot of it has to do with its nostalgia, nostalgic reasons. It's the first film that I saw in theaters, the first Bond film I saw in theaters. I remember my older sister took my brothers and I to the theaters to go see the movies. We had a double feature of Sphere, and the movie after that was Tomorrow Never Dies. Now, I didn't know this. This was a surprise. She surprised us with Tomorrow Never Dies. I thought we were just going to see Sphere, and I was a little bit disappointed because I was hoping we would go see Tomorrow Never Dies, but then I was surprised that we got to see it. So that was kind of cool. So I think, coming off of GoldenEye, at that time, so the movie came out in December 18, I think, in 1997. So I was 14. I just turned 14 not too long prior to that. Saw the movie, and I think that's part of why it's my favorite. Why I have a soft spot for this movie. I love Pierce Brosnan. I think if you ask who, everyone has their favorite Bond, right? Their Bond actor. Now, as a fan, I love them all. But my heart, it says, if I have to pick one, I pick Pierce Brosnan. And I don't think he's the best Bond, but that's my Bond. I came of age during his tenure. So I was in the right time to really be all up in the mix. And Pierce Brosnan happened to be the Bond to usher me into, through my puberty years and all of that. So that's another reason why it's a favorite. The musical score is fantastic. It's one of it's the first sort of I think post John Barry, who Bond fans know was the sort of the legendary Bond composer, composed the majority of the Bond films in the old days prior to the 1990s. David Arnold is probably, I think, still to this day, in my opinion, the true successor, like the truest successor of John Barry-esque composing for these Bond films. And I'm gonna get into that when I start getting more critical of the film. But I love the score. That's one of those sort of comfort food scores. You listen to it. It's just there are several tracks on there too that are just sort of endlessly listenable. And I think the other reason why it's a favorite, it's one of those prime sort of 90s action movies, but with the Bond, the Bond feel. As you're coming out of the 1980s, where the action, this is about, the action is heavy, but it retains some of the class and elegance that you expect in a Bond film. So I love it for that reason. Let's get into the more serious layers of it. So we talked about sort of generally why it's my favorite. What are we dealing with in this movie? This movie is a unique Bond film. You're not going to find it high on best of Bond film lists. It's probably going to be either near the bottom or somewhere in the middle somewhere, depending on who you are and what your tastes are in Bond world. But this film is essentially about Bond going up against Elliot Carver, who is the sort of media mogul, played by Jonathan Pryce, and who is essentially, the goal is to start a war. It's purely for ratings, television ratings. He wants to be the most watched news network in the world. He wants all the views. He wants all the attention. His goal is start a war just to get ratings, boost his reputation, boost his channel. That's it. Now on the surface, that's ridiculous. Why would you do that? When you have that in the conversation, and you got Bond in the mix, Bond is always about saving the world. It's always this world-saving situation. Almost every mission is that. So that's what we're dealing with here. The coolest things about this film, first of all, tell you about the music. Excellent, right? Excellent. Prime Bond scoring. The action is fantastic. The action is solid. It's a solid. It's thrilling. And so it's like a ride. It's like a thrill ride. Speaking of thrill rides, though, at the time this movie came out, if you remember, those of us in California, sort of Bay Area, whatever it is, who know Great America, Great America used to have a ride called License to Thrill, and it came out sort of around the same time. The ride there used to be Days of Thunder. When I was a younger kid, Days of Thunder was that ride, and then that became License to Thrill, which was there for some time, which then became another sort of, I think, Minions, whatever, some sort of a generic ride. You go into the movie theater, and you strap in, and you're watching sort of Bond action on a screen, but you are in it, like you're doing it, which is a perfect time to like have that happen, have that be the ride when you're coming off of GoldenEye, which is the first-person shooter stuff. It's like you're in the headspace of being Bond. And so that was a cool ride. And the movie Tomorrow Never Dies, the action in the movie is like a lot like that. And it's fun. It's fun action. The story is unique. I mean, plot aside with like Elliot Carver trying to start a war for ratings. But the more emotional piece of it, which isn't, unfortunately, you don't get a lot of it. But what you do get is it's cool to see. And I think this is where you see this from, particularly when we talk about Pierce Brosnan as Bond. He doesn't get a lot of praise for the emotion he brought and the sort of humanness that he brought to the role, his brand of it. A lot of talk right now anyway, that's sort of geared towards, Daniel Craig gets a lot of that talk because he, I think really unfairly, because for Pierce Brosnan anyway, unfairly for Pierce Brosnan, in that right now audiences seemed ready for a more sensitive Bond, and they weren't more than they ever were really. And I think Pierce Brosnan's Bond often gets criticized for not showing enough emotion or whatever it is, or really, which is not his fault. That's a scripting issue. Those stories were written with minimal pockets where he was able to sort of show real humanity. And this movie, it works well too. It pairs well coming off of GoldenEye because GoldenEye was such a also a very personal story where he's essentially going up against his brother, 006. He's going up against his friend who they were really close. And so you feel the pain in the betrayal in that. And so when you get to this movie, where you're dealing with Paris Carver, who was played by the beautiful Terry Hatcher, again, the timing of that, of her being cast, ridiculous. If you were a fan of Lois and Clark, which I was, my boy and I, he knows, if he's watching this, you know what I'm talking about. He knows what this is about because we talked about this. So Lois and Clark was hot during that time, right? And so to cast Terry Hatcher as a Bond girl, it's, you're destroying, that's world shattering stuff for a 13, 14-year-old kid who's already a fan of Lois and Clark, and she's in that, and she's already like ridiculous in that show too. So when you get to Tomorrow Never Dies, the expectation, at least for me at the time, is like, whoa, she's going to have she's going to be, and in a way she does have a meaty role, but in a lot of ways she doesn't really. She's unfortunately a bit of a prop in this film, which is that kind of sucks a little bit for her character, and how she, in terms of her character, for her character and how she relates to Bond, because she's someone who is important to him. These films, if you run the gamut, if you look at all the films, there are a handful of Bond women who really hit him, who really got him in the heart, right? And Paris is one of those. She's one of the ones who mattered. She wasn't one of the throwaway ones that you sort of mess around with just to pass the time as you're preparing your next move on the mission. Paris was, in another life, Paris might have been the one that he ended up with. But alas, that's not the situation. And I think, given that, that's cool. Any type of situation where you have a character like Bond dealing with someone who means something, that's always great fun to see. And that was an aspect that I think brought out some feeling from Pierce Brosnan's Bond, and that's cool. So in the midst of all the action and all the explosions and the silly quips and the bad guy monologues and all that type of stuff, you have something in the nugget of what Pierce Brosnan gives you, and but that's something that Pierce Brosnan brings to the role already, and it's written in the script, but how he plays it, you feel that, and so I've always appreciated that. And you really felt like this was someone he actually loved. Bond loved this woman. He wasn't just sort of messing around with her. He loved her. And so I always feel stuff when I watch this movie and go through sort of, the motions of experiencing their relationship, and even the stuff we don't see, stuff that's sort of talked about, their backstory and stuff it's fun to imagine them having happy times and stuff before this mission. so that's cool. That's another cool thing about the movie. The other thing about it, speaking of Bond girls, is we got to transition into Michelle Yeoh, who is, you already know what time it is. If you know Michelle Yeoh, she's a gangster in everything she does. And I remember at the time watching it, and I hadn't thought about this in some years, but I remember when I watched it, how cool it was to see Bond with an equal. And this is at the time when I was first getting into it. Now, though, having since watched all the films a million times and everything, you don't see a lot of Bond films where Bond is paired up with a Bond girl who is an equal, right? Usually they come to the table with some set of skills that are important for the plot and that help Bond with the mission or whatever it is. Or they're there as props just for us to, we know she's hot, and she's going to die or whatever it is. Like that, these are, the Bond girls only fulfill, they fulfill certain roles. And sometimes there's not a lot of agency with them. But Michelle Yeoh's Bond character, Wei Lin, is a character with tremendous agency. She's essentially the Chinese People's External Security Force's 007. Like Major Anya Amasova is in The Spy Who Loved Me, Triple X, she's the KGB's 007. and so forth. There are there are a handful of them throughout the series who are also agents who are good at what they do, and they make perfect partners for Bond in missions. So Michelle Yeoh is fantastic. She has a great action sequence at the end of the second act, which is fantastic. It's just, it's prime Michelle Yeoh from what you see in any of her martial arts performances. But also, she brings some weight to it. She's not just, her role is not a throwaway Bond girl role. She's got some real heft in terms of in the acting department. We all already know she's a fantastic actor. You expect the physical stuff because she comes to the table with that. But the acting is solid too, and she's a great foil for Pierce Brosnan's Bond. Fantastic. And then Jonathan Pryce, to go back to the villains here. He's just he's having a lot of fun. It feels like to me he's just having a fun time, reveling in everything that Elliot Carver is about. Like, he's loving that attention, and he's a character that has some, obviously some degree of intelligence and stuff. And he's a solid Bond villain. He's far from the best Bond villain, but and I think just because of the nature of the story, you don't really get to see. There are elements where you can see how he's a real threat. Although you do have to question the logic when it comes to how does a media mogul, no matter how much power you have in terms of satellites and how much reach you have media-wise, how do you have, I suppose you could, if you have a lot of money, then I guess you could pay for security forces and security teams and, military dudes who can, I guess you can pay for that. But it feels like, if your game is media, and how do you have access to all these military dudes who are able to like secure all your stuff? You have like major, like, where all the henchmen come from? Like, how do you, you must be really rich if you can pay for that many dudes to help you carry out your dastardly terrorist plan. Anyway, that's beside the point. But Jonathan Pryce is fantastic he's great in this role. It is a step down coming from, as far as Bond villains go, coming off of GoldenEye with 006, who's one of the best Bond villains. Going from that to Elliot Carver, is a bit of a drop, but it's also just different. It's a different thing because Jonathan Pryce is an older actor at that stage, older than Sean Bean, and so he brings a certain gravitas to the role that is almost like Stromberg, Carl Stromberg from Moonraker, or excuse me, the Spy Who Loved Me. He's like that kind of villain, intelligent, threatening, also a little bit comical, and he's not afraid to have fun. He's having some fun with the role, so that's cool. It's almost like Jonathan Pryce treats it. It feels like he's playing a Shakespearean villain, but without the. There's a little bit of well, not really. I was going to say there's some pathos, but there isn't really. But there is a little bit of like you don't really you're kind of neutral. You don't really care about his plight and why he's doing what he's doing, especially when you discover that, hey, he's just doing this for ratings. It's like, what are you doing, man? What the what? Are you that bored that you just you have a really high opinion of yourself, and it's just that's Carver. That's where he's at. Down the list, you got Stamper. Forget the actor who plays him, but Stamper is actually a great, as far as henchmen go. Bond has a lot of good henchmen. Stamper, I think, is a solid henchman. Again, he's like an odd job. He's not Odd Job, Jaws, all those dudes. I think he fits well in the henchman situations, like the sort of he's in that group. And Stamper's great. He got some good. He's got some great lines. He's a physically imposing character, and I think you need that as far as henchmen are concerned. You need that. The other thing I think is cool, that I haven't thought about, that is Tomorrow Never Dies is the only Bond film, to my knowledge, that has a a mission briefing that is mobile, which I think is kind of cool. You know, all the Bond films have an obligatory briefing scene, which is the scene, what I'm talking about. Bond goes in to meet M, who is his boss, played in this film by Judi Dench, Dame Judi Dench, who's amazing as always. And he gets the mission, and where she sends him off to his mission, and he has to go do his thing. Now, historically, these they're always in an office at the main sort of Universal Exports office. He has to go in, get the files, talk to his boss, and they send him on his mission. Sometimes it's on location, right, where it's on a sort of secret base somewhere or somewhere else. But Tomorrow Never Dies is the only one where Bond is sort of en route somewhere, and they're all in a car doing the mission briefing, and the chief of staff is there. So you got Robinson is up in the car with them. Moneypenny, they're all in the same car. Like they're all in the car along, presumably on the journey to the airport. I always thought that they were taking him to the airport. He was going straight away to that mission. I think that's cool that the mission briefing is on the go. And I don't think any other Bond film does that. This is a fun Bond film. I can't say enough about it. Critically speaking, it's not the best, but if you're looking just for a fun time, and something that's even marginally compelling with good action, great music, and just the honest to goodness 90s Bond story. It's very 90s too. Bond story. Hit this movie up. This movie, it'll get you what you need. And I have to say too, separately, I watched it recently on DVD. And remember those DVDs? But again, Tomorrow Never Dies is special because this is the only film on DVD that has a music-only track. And I highly recommend, if you have it on DVD or if you don't have it, if you can get your hands on it, to watch the movie and then watch it again with a music-only track. It's a unique experience to watch the whole movie with no dialogue and just the music. And I think it was a great idea for whoever was in charge of creating the DVDs to put the music only track as an option on the film, because what it does is it highlights the strength of the music, which is the strength of the film. And I think for a lot of films, just in general, sometimes a score is a score that you may not pay attention to. It may not mean anything to you. But for Bond, I think your film can live or die by how strong the score is. David Arnold, scored this film, and a lot of his musical imprints, his footprint is on all the music, including both title songs, like the main title sequence song, and then sort of what I call the B-side title song. So a lot of these films sometimes have two. What I feel like wasn't always the case. It's sporadically has been the case throughout the series. But Tomorrow Never Dies has the title song "Tomorrow Never Dies" by Sheryl Crow performing this one, and "Surrender" by K.D. Lang, and which "Surrender" is a fantastic song. They're both good songs. I agree with the opinion that "Surrender" might have been a better title song, but neither here nor there. But anyway, the music is tight. So highly recommend watching the film with the music only track because it's amazing. And I think too, I'll say one other thing about the music. At that time, David Arnold stepping into the composer's chair was kind of a big deal. And I think in hindsight, you can see it coming off of like GoldenEye, which was a decent score and had good things about it, but didn't always feel like Bond. Like things had to be, there's a whole story about that. I'll get into that when I talk about GoldenEye. But when you go from, if you even look at just the three, look at License to Kill, which is before GoldenEye, and Tomorrow Never Dies, just those three films alone musically, and how much they do or don't feel like Bond. Between those three films, Tomorrow Never Dies feels the most like sort of classic Bond feel, updated for the 90s. Now, this isn't to say that License to Kill also feels like a Bond score, but it feels very much infused with late 80s action movie type of stuff. If you know things like Die Hard or Lethal Weapon, Michael Kamen was a composer for those films, and he also composed License to Kill. So you can hear Die Hard / Lethal Weapon in a License to Kill score, which puts it feels like Bond with but harder edge Bond. So it's almost like it's Lethal Weapon, Die Hard, Bond, which you don't get that from Tomorrow Never Dies. That feels like John Barry updated though, and GoldenEye is a unique thing altogether. It's its own thing. The sounds are very unique. There aren't type of sounds, not a lot of brass instruments and bombastic. There's one sequence in that movie that actually feels like the most like a Bond-esque scored situation. But Tomorrow Never Dies, though, is the best example of that from those three films. And I think if you're into that type of stuff, if you're into music scores and stuff like that, it's a good. I think watching the film without the dialogue and just with the music is a good experience. So I think that's going to do it on this one. Thank you this was another long one. So thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I'm excited to talk more about Bond at some point. We're into November now. I have a couple other movies that I watched and reviewed in October that I'll get those up. But I figured since we're in November now, and November for a lot of kids, 90s kids anyway, who grew up on like TBS and other channels that showed Bond, this is about, November, December is Bond time. It is for me anyway. And it's Thanksgiving time, Christmas time. You might see a few more Bond reviews between now and the end of the year. So look forward to that. In the meantime, that's going to be it. I'm out of here. I'll see you guys in the next one.